I would rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned. Hi, I'm Kerry Cunningham. I'm a former Sirius Decisions and Forrester analyst, and I'm starting up a research and thought leadership function at 6 Sense. Now, most importantly for this conversation, I'm your host for the Science of B2B podcast. Now, the line I started with is a quote from one of my favorite people from history. His name was Richard Feynman. He was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist in the field of quantum mechanics, whatever that actually is. He was a key contributor to the Manhattan Project, but also a jazz drummer and author of really funny memoirs. He was an amateur safecracker, a highly decorated teacher, and then later in his life, after he'd won the Nobel Prize and he'd become famous, he took up drawing and very successfully sold his drawings under a pseudonym. And he did that so that people wouldn't be buying his drawings just because he was a famous guy. Now, despite all that, if you know his name, it's probably because he was the guy who solved the mystery of this Space Shuttle Challenger explosion. We'll probably talk about that again. It's fascinating. Now, why am I telling you this to start off a podcast about B2B? Well, that line from Feynman captures the essence of the approach we'll be taking here on the Science of B2B. You're going to hear a lot more from Feynman. For example, like right now, Feynman had what he called his first principle, one of my favorite things. And this really gets at the heart of the Science of B2B project. Feynman's first principle says, you must not fool yourself. And he goes on to say, and you are the easiest person to fool, so you have to be very careful about that. Now, we've done a lot of fooling ourselves in B2B. I know I have. So there's a lot of work to do there. Now, in addition to Feynman, we'll draw from a host of other thinkers from science, but also from literature, from music, wherever we find ideas and attitudes that will help us better understand our corner of the business universe. So, hello, and thanks for tuning in. As we get started, there are a couple of things I want you to know right away, and then you can decide if you want to continue listening or watching. First, I promise you this is not going to be like any other business podcast you've listened to. Really. And you may already be getting a sense for that. Second, if what you want are quick tips on how to improve lead scoring or service level agreements, you'll want to be selective in the episodes you listen to. We'll probably talk about those things sometimes, but to be clear, I completely and absolutely reject the idea that you need to come away from every episode or conversation with action items. That's how you get 12 years into using a process like points-based lead scoring without ever asking whether it makes any sense at all. And so as not to leave anyone in suspense about whether it makes any sense at all, it does not. But if you are using it, we'll talk about how to use it more effectively on the way to weaning yourself off of it. Now, if what you want is to have your mind open to new ways of inhabiting and thriving in our B2B ecosystem, then you've come to the right place. If you want to be inspired to follow up on that kernel of an idea you came up with to drive your business and career forward, then you've come to the right place. Now, finally, I want to assure you that I take the title of this podcast very seriously. This will not be the pseudoscience of B2B. This won't be the gut feel or intuition of B2B, though we will talk about what those things are and what their uses and limitations are. There's a lot of science around it, and it's fascinating. This is the Science of B2B. So a word on the science bit, because I know it can seem a bit intimidating. And I know that for most of my life, science and math gave me the shivers. And the truth is, I'm still pretty easily befuddled by a map. I need it to talk to me and tell me where to go. But I was always very curious and very skeptical that what I was being told about the world was true. So if you're watching or listening to this now, I suspect that you have a similar attitude, and that's good enough. Curiosity and a healthy skepticism are all that's required. And you know, we've landed in a really interesting place. And what I intend to do is dig deeply into this field we work in. We're going to question a lot of the answers we've been given. We'll figure out what does and doesn't make sense, I hope. We'll consider a lot of possible answers. We'll change our minds. We'll change the minds of others, I hope. And here at 6 Sense, I'm leading a Science of B2B team where we're already diving into a lot of these issues in primary research. So I'll share what we're finding there as we find it. Now, as far as how we'll do it, sometimes it will be just me, in which case I'll remain upstanding. And sometimes I'll have guests on to explain, discuss, and debate. Sometimes it'll be a monologue like this, but sometimes I'll also present and use visual aids. We'll have fun at it, I think. We'll see how chicken farming can help us understand the B2B buying process, how the germ theory of disease should inspire us to ask more of our lead management processes, and even how the Human Genome Project should inform how you think about your web traffic, and much else besides. We'll have episodes where we talk about practical things, like I can't wait to dig into this double funnel nonsense with you. But often the only action you'll come away with is putting your chin on your hand to think, or maybe to pull together a couple of colleagues to question something that you've been doing. To me, that's perfect. Now, I'll finish the introduction to this podcast with this. Along my journey into a more scientific way of seeing the world, I discovered a lot of remarkable thinkers, from Darwin to Walt Whitman, who inspired a lot of my wonder in the world, to Virginia Woolf, who inspired me to take a chance or two on myself, Joseph Campbell, Rosalind Franklin, Jane Goodall, Maeve Leakey, many, many, many others. There are so many shoulders to stand on. I want to present you with some of those shoulders, the ones that I know. And I hope that I'll learn about shoulders to stand on from you as well. So that's the plan here at Science of B2B. I'll end with this. One phrase that has stuck with me since I first read it. It comes from Charles Darwin himself, and it comes from the end of The Origin of Species. Now, context is that he's publishing a book that really does threaten the established order of society in which he lives. He is a genteel man. He's no rabble-rouser. But his dangerous idea, as it was called then and still is called by many today, contradicts what the religion everyone else in his orbit has been taught, that man was the product of special creation. No, says Darwin, we are evolved from earlier life forms just like everything else that has ever lived. We know this as one of the most thoroughly proven facts of life today. But at the time, it was new and it was very controversial. Many objected that being evolved diminished us and reduced us to biological processes devoid of meaning and devoid of value. But Darwin says of this new idea, there is grandeur in this view of life. And that's how he begins. And then he finishes by saying, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. I get a little bit verklempt every time I read that. So is there grandeur in this view of B2B? Do we have endless forms, most beautiful and wonderful in B2B? I don't want to overplay my hand here. I don't know if there's grandeur, but I do know that there is a very great deal to be fascinated by. And I know it's a lot more interesting than I had supposed in the early part of my career, and more fascinating and rewarding to think about than many of you may now believe. So starting next week, we're going to get into it. We're going to dig into some of what I think are the single most important themes for organizations to be paying attention to today and transforming around. And that is understanding that your buyer is not an individual person, it's a group. We're going to talk about how we know that, why we know that, what to do about it. And we'll get started next week. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.